Olá, hoje é dia 20 de março de 2017, estamos aqui no Observatório da Inovação e Competitividade, no Instituto de Estudos Avançados da USP. Meu nome é Mário Sérgio Salerno, sou do Observatório, e eu queria apresentar para vocês John Humphrey. John Humphrey, pelo nome, como vocês percebem, é inglês, certo? É admirador de futebol, pelo menos era, certo? Enfim. Mas nosso assunto aqui não é futebol. O John vai discutir cadeias globais de valor e inovação na China. E o John é, assim, do grupo restrito de grandes pesquisadores no mundo que trabalham sistematicamente sobre cadeias globais de inovação. É global mesmo, certo? Envolvendo o cruzamento de algumas fronteiras. O John é da Universidade de Sussex, da Escola de Negócios, da Business School, da Universidade de Sussex. O nosso esquema aqui de funcionamento é relativamente simples. Os internautas que quiserem fazer perguntas, comentários, etc., enviam um e-mail para iearesponde@usp.br. Então, IEA de Instituto, E de Estudos, A de Avançados, Responde de Responde. IEA responde tudo junto, @usp.br. A pergunta ou comentário chega, eu leio e o John comenta. Tá? O trânsito da internet ele tem algumas particularidades. Às vezes a gente acha que é instantâneo, mas ele não é. Às vezes ele demora. Tá? Então existe a possibilidade de aqueles que forem teclar seus comentários, perguntas, etc., muito ao final do evento, de a gente não receber. Ou então receber quando o evento acabou, que na prática significa não recebê-lo. Então vocês, por favor, antecipem as suas questões. Tá? E é isso. Bom, John, muito obrigado. Eu esqueci de dizer, o John está aqui no Brasil, a convite do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Engenharia de Produção da Poli, tá? Onde ele está ministrando um curso sobre cadeias globais de inovação. O curso já está do meio para o fim, mais ou menos. Tá? E é isso. Okay? John, obrigado pela presença. John vai falar em inglês, ok? Mas ele entende português. Então, se alguém quiser fazer uma pergunta em português, o que ele não entender, eu posso traduzir, outros aqui que estão fisicamente aqui na sala podem ajudar a traduzir também, ok?
Okay. Thank you, Mario, for that introduction. Let me say the title of my presentation is Value Chains and Innovation in China. That's to say I'm not going to be talking about global value chains. I'm going to be talking about value chains within China and regional value chains linking China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, etc. And the value chain methodology is a methodology which is scalable. That's to say you can use the core concepts to look at local value chains, national value chains, regional, as well as global value chains. And the reason that I want to talk about this topic is that over the past 20 years or so, we've developed a value chain methodology and an approach to looking at value chains at different scales. And we have certain assumptions about how they work. And yet, last year I was doing some work with colleagues in Japan, and we found some characteristics of value chains in China that challenged some of our assumptions. So I want to talk a little bit about what we found in China and the speed of change in China and the way in which this has implications for our more general theorizing about the nature of value chains. So what I want to do today then is, first of all, talk a little bit about the challenge facing China. Secondly, focus specifically on the cell phone sector, that's cell phone handsets being made in China and marketed within China. Thirdly, I want to talk about how that sector changed after 2010. And thirdly, talk about the reasons for that, those changes. And as I've just said, this presentation is based on research carried out not just by me, but in fact by a team of researchers, both Chinese and Japanese, at the Institute of Developing Economies in Tokyo, specifically Dinka, Mai Fujita, Shiro Hiroki, and Koichiro Kimura. So this is a presentation of some of the findings that we as a group have come to on the basis of the research that we're doing, a 2-year project that started a year ago, so we have 1 more year to further study this. So what are the challenges facing China then? Well, as you know, China is often seen, and rightly so, as a success story in terms of economic growth. If you look at the country over the last 30 years, there's been a combination of rapid growth. For a long period of time, that growth being sustained at or above 10% a year, which means the economy doubles in size every 7 years. Growth has now fallen to maybe 5-6%. That, in fact, may be an overestimate. But even 5% would be a rate of growth that most of Latin America, including Brazil, would be very happy to achieve every now and again, rather than be disappointed that it's happening year after year. We also know that that rapid growth has led to a massive fall in poverty in China. The number of people, or number of households earning less than $2 a day has fallen by hundreds of millions in the last 30 years. And if we actually look at rates of poverty reduction across the world, most of the poverty reduction has actually taken place in China. It's had a massive impact on the global levels of poverty, those earning under $1 a day or those earning under $2 a day. However, that model is in crisis, or at least it's facing certain challenges. And one challenge is the slowdown in growth. Another is that the government wants to reduce its dependence on exports and export markets and try to increase the extent to which the economy is inward-oriented, increasing investment and particularly domestic consumption. And then but then the issue becomes one of what about changes in the domestic market itself? How are they affecting the capacity of Chinese firms to meet the demands of consumers? Because we know that a lot of the success of the Chinese economy in the past, both in the export and domestic market, has been with its ability to perform relatively simple tasks and produce relatively simple products very cheaply. Become the workshop of the world because it provides the world's demand for cheap products. You know, we all know about clothing, we know about toys. Last year I was in a town in the center of China where they export things to the whole of the world. I don't know whether in Brazil you have a chain, an American chain called Accessorize, that sells lots of cheap stuff. You can find, most of that stuff is probably produced in China, and they're very good at producing these very cheap, standardized products for mass consumption around the world. And of course, Chinese factories have also assembled many of the products that we most value in the modern world. High-tech products, but Chinese companies doing the low-tech part of assembly of those products, such as the iPhone and iPad. But of course, the thing about economic development is that the more successful you are, and China's probably been the most successful economy over the last, has been the most successful economy over the past 30 years, is that very success creates new challenges. And the big challenge is that incomes in China have risen as a result of its success. When you're growing at 10% a year, then even with increasing income inequality, the wages of workers in particular, workers in these export factories and domestic factories, have tended to rise very sharply, and they're rising very sharply at the moment. So that means that that the cost of producing goods in China is rising, but also that consumers in China are becoming more sophisticated. We have a rising middle class, we have working people with higher incomes, and they're becoming more discriminating. They don't necessarily want cheap products. They want products that have more functionality, that maybe have a brand, that maybe, if you're a little bit more wealthy, shows products that show how rich you are. You know, the demonstration of wealth. And so what we're finding then is that the government want to switch demand towards consumer demand within China, but those Chinese consumers themselves are becoming much more demanding and want higher functionality and more product differentiation. So how do firms in China manage to adapt to that new market reality? And what I want to do is to talk about this adaptation and its implications for value chains in China within the context of mobile phones. What I'm going to do then is to make a contrast between the mobile phone market, particularly the low-end mobile phone market for consumption in China, before 2010 and after 2010. So what do we know about domestic value chains, and particularly not just the mobile phone sector, but particularly the mobile phone sector? What do we know about those products in the period, or those industries rather, before 2010? Well, the first thing we note is that in China, we see levels of industrial concentration. That's to say, the amount of the output of a sector which is taken by the largest firms, largest 3, largest 5, largest 7, whatever, however you want to calculate. We see levels of industrial concentration in China that are characteristically much lower than in other economies. We have many more firms, and we don't have a few firms dominating the market. And I can show you this by looking at this comparison. This is data on 3 firm concentration ratios. That's to say that the amount of production in a sector which is accounted for by the 3 largest firms. And this is a comparison of China with India and Japan. So one large developing country and one Asian developed country. And what you can see is that the blue bars, which are China, are much lower than the red and the green bars, which are for India and Japan. And so levels of concentration across, just taken 4 sectors here: air conditioners, automobiles, TVs, and motorcycles. You can see that levels of concentration are substantially lower in China than they are in India and Japan. If you just look at automobiles, for example, the 3 firm concentration ratio in China is 30%, or just below. The 3 firm concentration ratio in India is 80%. You look at motorcycles, again, China below 30%, but Japan and India 85, 95%. So much lower levels of concentration. Many more firms operating in these particular sectors. And if you take automobiles, for example, which is a sector which traditionally is relatively concentrated, you have a few large firms dominating the industry, then we see, for example, that back in 2009, the country with the second largest number of automobile assemblers, companies that provided engines and chassis, put together cars with both engines and chassis, that the country with the second largest number of those types of businesses was the UK, with about 20 assemblers. Of those 20, a number of them were really small companies that produce bespoke sports cars like TVR, and selling, or Rolls-Royce at the other end of the market, selling hundreds, maybe 1,000 cars a year, but relatively small. At the same time in China in 2009, there were 54 different brands selling at least 50,000 cars a year. 54. Now you might think that that's because in China there are a lot of loss-making nationalized or state-owned enterprises, and that the market is not open, and therefore it's a distorted market. And this just reflects the fact that the government doesn't want to close down loss-making companies. In fact, of those 54 enterprises, 48 were profit-making. There were very few loss-making companies. And in fact, over the last 25 years, the government has had a policy of trying to promote concentration because it sees fewer, larger firms as leading to rises in productivity. So this proliferation of firms, even in the auto industry, is actually in spite of government policy, not because of government policy. So, this is the challenge of. So that's the first characteristic that I want to note, which is this low levels of industrial concentration, and you see it in other sectors like toys, garments, and the rest. But there are other very distinctive characteristics as well. And the second one is what we might call highly disintegrated value chains. And just thinking about the mobile phone, cell phone handset sector, we can see that handset manufacturers buy out, that's to say they don't make themselves, they purchase from other suppliers, rely on other firms for key inputs, such as design of printed circuit boards, molds for casings, software, the core chipset at the heart of a mobile phone, that all of those aspects of the product are actually outsourced. So the firms themselves do relatively little when it comes to manufacturing. In fact, many of them even outsource manufacturing to specialist contract assembly. Outsource assembly to specialist contract assembly. In spite of that high degree of de-verticalization, value chains in the industry are mostly arm's length. That's to say that there is very little integration and communication and exchange of knowledge between companies along the value chain. And again, if I take the case of the auto industry, Professor Tomoe Marukawa at the University of Tokyo highlights, for example, that Chinese automobile manufacturers don't seem to communicate very much with their suppliers. What he argues in this period up to 2010 is that Chinese assemblers, if they have a defective product, they merely send it back to the supplier and fine the supplier. That's to say the supplier has to pay money for supplying a defective product. But they don't communicate to the supplier what the defect is. They're not working like Japanese firms and saying, let's work together to find out what the problem is and improve the quality of the products that are being supplied. They don't seem to be interested in doing this. And finally, I just want to emphasize that we are talking here about value chain characteristics in sectors that not just, the sectors with very well established, relatively simple technologies like garments, but sectors that are experiencing technological change, such as cell phones, motorcycles, air conditioning, refrigeration, automotive, and televisions. These characteristics that I've just described are very common across at least parts of a wide range of sectors. And I think that the key to this capacity to have de-verticalization, low levels of concentration, arm's length market relationships, lies in the issue of technology platforms. But what these companies are doing in China is relying on the bundling of the key technologies into relatively easy to use inputs that can be purchased at arm's length and then used by firms that have relatively limited technological capability. So the vital technologies are packaged and presented in an easy-to-use format. For example, and I'll talk about this, we can look at cell phones. We can see how the core technologies are actually provided predominantly by foreign companies, particularly a Chinese company called MediaTek or MTK. And that the Chinese firms rely on this easy-to-use technology as a basis for being able to compete in this market. And the advantages for the Chinese firms of this packaging of technology into easy-to-use modules, if you want, is that it lowers barriers to entry because these Chinese firms don't need to invest in technology development. It reduces capability requirements for entry, and that it's the modular architecture and standardized interfaces that allow for specialization and vertical disintegration. So these technology platforms are behind many of the characteristics of this industry. And what I want to do is to talk about this specifically in the context of mobile phones. So, if we look on the top right hand of this diagram, you can look at both the hardware and software at 3 layers of a mobile phone. This is mobile phones pre-2010, right? So it's not the smartphones that are increasingly dominant today. It's what in Japan and China they call feature phones. I don't know what they're called in Brazil or even in the UK for that matter. So that the core chipset that is at the heart of the technology of a mobile phone at one point involved some of the software at the first 2 levels and some of the core hardware. What MTK, MediaTek, did in order to open up the Chinese market and provide a product that would be accessible to low technology Chinese firms, or Chinese firms with low technological capabilities, was to provide a chipset that integrated much more of all of this software and hardware onto a single chip. Bringing in the radio frequency hardware and then bundling much more of the software into a single chip so that companies bought most of the product already well defined. So this strategy made the use of the core technology much easier for these Chinese companies. And I should say this is a strategy that MTK, MediaTek, had also developed in relation to optical disk drives and the core chipsets for controlling flat-screen televisions earlier. And so it was leveraging its knowledge in those 2 sectors to do something similar in the case of mobile phones. And this enables companies like MediaTek to rapidly gain market share at the global level. We can see this across these different products. Now, what this does then is simplify the technology from the point of view of the user. So as well as providing the core technology on a single chip, MTK also provided technical support to the users of the product. We want to maximize use of the product because that maximizes sales. And so it helps consumers understand and use the product. That's to say, incorporate it into their handsets. So it provided technical support. It had a very relaxed attitude towards licensing. It charged low fees, and it didn't appear to do very much to stop businesses using its technology without a license. So again, it was maximizing usage. And also it helped companies incorporate the core technology into a product by, for example, providing reference designs for printed circuit boards, showing bills of materials. So if you do use this product, what are the components that you need to buy? So it's really, in a sense, doing not most, but a lot of the work that's required by these companies to turn a chipset into a finished product. And one summary of what MTK was doing is provided by this quote, which is from Eric Toon and Lauren Brandt, 2 American writers, saying that what MTK did was provide a complete turnkey solution. A domestic hand firm could purchase an MTK solution and extensively customize the user interface and functionality, or it could use the basic interface and essentially slap on a casing. So what are the Chinese firms doing? Well, they're putting a casing around a product with components that come from somewhere else. And even the casing, they relied on specialist mold manufacturers or designers to actually do the work of providing the plastic casing. So that's the extreme, okay? And what that means is then you can get massive degrees of fragmentation because the barriers to entry are so low. So in 2010, it was estimated there were 2,000 different companies producing branded handsets in China. Using technology platforms, the use of design houses for printed circuit design, the use of specialist mold makers for design and production of plastic casings, and even using contract assembly. So that's the kind of industry we're facing. And also, I should say, using specialist outlets for distribution. And of course, this is a model that not only has an impact on China, but it has an impact on the rest of the world. I was in Shenzhen a few months ago, and somebody there argued that the Arab Spring was made possible by cheap Chinese mobiles, because that's how people communicated with each other. And they could do that because a Chinese company will export a mobile to India or Africa for a final price of $11, $12. And we met a company that, a small, by Chinese standards, not a particularly large company. We met the head of sales of a company there in Shenzhen. And they're producing phones exporting for $12. A smartphone they will export for under $80. And they're selling overseas 1.5 million phones every month. So that's 18 million phones a year that they're exporting. And they don't supply the Chinese market because they say the market's too tough. It's easier to sell to other parts of the world where competition is lower. So, that's the market that we're looking at. And so to summarize that, we have, remember before the smartphone, we have this sector, these small firms, alongside the big branded companies. So Apple are there, Samsung are there, Nokia were there. Remember the market has changed, I'll talk about that. Selling low-cost phones, maybe half the price of a mainstream branded phone. Relatively simple, little product differentiation because you bought all the parts in, so there's very little left to differentiate. And aimed at lower income consumers, particularly in small towns in rural areas. And although I don't have it here, by 2010, this sort of small firm sector was responsible for something like 360 million phones a year, which is 1/3 of total Chinese production of mobile phones in that year. They were producing around 1 billion mobile phones a year for export and the domestic market. 1/3 of those were coming from this low-end sector with the characteristics that I've just described. Now, so what we have then, and this is what is, so this is actually in some ways quite a challenge for us to understand. Because when we look at the East Asian model of industrialization, and we think of Taiwan, we think of Hong Kong, we think of South Korea, we think of industries and sectors where everybody wants to upgrade. They want to gain new technological capacities. You say, look at Taiwan. They used to assemble laptops, and now they have their own brands. They design, they brand, you look at flat screen televisions. You say, well, when Korea first started, it imported all of the main components, and Taiwan as well for that matter. They imported most of the key elements and the core materials for making flat screen televisions from other countries, particularly Japan. But over a period of time, they dominated the technology themselves and brought to within Korea many of the elements that you need to put together a flat screen television. Here in China, we see the opposite. We see companies who don't seem to have any interest in acquiring these technological capabilities. What they're doing, and very successfully, is saying, we'll buy in the technology, we focus on marketing, we focus on distribution, we focus on organizing the rest of the chain, but we're not very interested in acquiring manufacturing capabilities. And that's a bit of a, that's different to what we've seen in other parts of, even other parts of Asia. And so that's why the sector is most interesting. And this is summarized in a comment by two Japanese authors, Ge and Takahiro Fujimoto, who some of you may have heard of, saying, one salient paradoxical phenomenon amid the fast growth of China's manufacturing industry is why enterprises expand production volumes in a speedy way, the accumulation of their R&D capabilities lags far behind. So we have very competitive companies who don't seem to be particularly interested in acquiring R&D. So then the issue is, and this is the fundamental question for the research we were doing, does this market survive the changes that I described earlier on of the consumer market in China? What happens when Chinese consumers aren't interested in what in England we would call cheap and cheerful? Simple products, cheap, basic, but they do the job. Okay? What happens when consumers want something a bit more? And I want to look at this issue in terms of mobile phones. And if I summarize the change, it's the change from this, which you saw early on, cheap products, lots of them, they're all pretty much the same, not very sophisticated in terms of how they're presented to the consumer. And this is probably in a market stall somewhere, shift or a specialized market. A shift from this to this. This is a photo I took in Shenzhen. And the things you notice about this photo is firstly brands. Oppo and Vivo are two big Chinese brands. And secondly, the shop looks like a shop that I would certainly find in the UK. You know, in terms of the lighting, the glass shelves, the modernity. I guess it's the same in Brazil. I haven't been doing any big sort of in-depth market surveys while I've been here the last couple of weeks. But I guess that you probably have the same kind of thing in Brazil. In the UK, mobile phone shops, which are often owned by the carriers, you know, the telecom companies, are very bright. They look very modern. You know, you kind of, you know, they're you know, there's a certain atmosphere, and they're all pretty much the same. And you know, I think I would expect to find something similar in Brazil. And so this is the contrast. This is what's changed, and I want to talk about what that change means, what it implies for the value chain, and also what the explanatory factors might be. And I realise, Mario, that I probably need to not be quite so extensive in my discussion. Right, okay. So what do we find after 2010 then? Well, first of all, we find that small sector that I said had 1/3 of the total market, that declined very rapidly after 2010. The estimates from industry insiders is that it declined in terms of 90% in terms of volume of production between 2010 and 2016, and 90% in terms of number of firms, and that the key reason behind that was their failure to really get into the smartphone and 4G market. Instead, what we get is the emergence of these companies that you just saw on the previous slide, Oppo and Vivo and Xiaomi and others, more consumer-focused, active Chinese brands. We also see that you might think that if this small firm sector declined, then maybe the gap in the market was taken up by international brands such as Samsung and Apple, or by the established Chinese brands like Huawei and ZTE. That doesn't appear to be the case. What we've had is the emergence of new Chinese companies that have taken up this slack in the market, like Oppo, Vivo, and Xiaomi. In terms of value chain integration, we see a lot more vertical integration. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. We also see greater coordination along the chain, more complex exchanges of information. We see increasing use of brand-specific distribution channels that you just saw in that photograph. And we also see increasing investments in capability acquisition. That's to say, these companies are investing much more in R&D, both in hardware and software. So we went to visit last October Vivo in Shenzhen, and we talked to the head of their R&D department, and he said he had 750 R&D engineers working on hardware and software. I don't know whether 750 is a large number of software engineers for one company, one telephone company, but it's certainly a lot more than we saw in 10 years ago. And so they're investing very heavily. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, I think that we've got two possible explanations for these changes that I want to talk about in the final part of my presentation. First of all, we might think that these changes are driven by changes in technology, because phone technology has changed a lot. Or secondly, it might be the result of this changing consumer demand and markets within China. And I'm going to talk about both of those. I don't think it's a question of saying it's definitely one or definitely the other. I think in our future research, we'll have to talk about the interaction between the two, but I'm going to talk about the possible impacts of both of these changes in this presentation, because we don't have an answer about how they interact. And I'm going to start by looking at changes in consumer demands and markets. So what's happening in terms of consumer demand, particularly in the mobile phone sector? Well, an analysis of changing consumer demand in China by McKinsey & Co. that was published last year, they do regular surveys of consumers in China, and they said that the things that have changed in the last 3 or 4 years since their previous survey was firstly that Chinese consumers have growing discretionary spending. That's to say, they have higher incomes. The amount that they need for basics is going to remain unchanged or go up relatively little, so they have more money left over for things that they don't need, but things that they want. And phones are part of that. And secondly, they say there's clearly an increased willingness of Chinese consumers to pay more to trade up to premium brands. And one of the things we've seen in the last 3 years in the smartphone sector is a decline in the share of smartphone sales that go to smartphones under $100, cheap ones, and a rise in the share of smartphones in terms of numbers sold in China, domestic market, for high-end phones that cost over $300. The middle segments remained pretty much the same, and the shift has been a decline in low and a similar proportional rise in high-end smartphones. And what does that imply for the value chain? Well, firstly, it means that the companies wanting to sell these better phones or more expensive phones need to collaborate with technology suppliers much more than they did in the past to create greater functionality and product differentiation. So rather than using standardized chips and standardized inputs, they're looking for something which makes their phone stand out, something different. You know, whether that's more memory, whether it's a larger screen, and so on. And just to give you one rather amusing example, we were talking to one company last year, and they said that what they really wanted to do was combine the camera of the phone for people taking selfies. You know, what do you call selfies? Selfies, okay. Selfies, okay. We have a global language here. With the software that enables people to improve the quality of photographs. They were basically saying selfies are predominantly taken by young women, and what we want is a product that improves the photograph, that takes away the blemishes, that the sort of the things that you might do if you were editing a photograph for a magazine in Photoshop. Now, in order to do that, you need to be looking at the phone, the software, the operating system, the quality or the characteristics of the camera. You know, in fact, you need to talk with a lot of different people contributing to that phone along the value chain in order to be able to achieve this particular functionality. And so with these types of functionality and product differentiation, you need to tighten up and increase the collaboration along the value chain, more knowledge, more joint action in order to produce products with this product differentiation and increased functionality. I don't know whether they've achieved that phone, by the way. That was a plan that they had and that they were in the process of implementing. And so what we might think then is the introduction of smartphones and increased functionality may actually reduce the ability to slice up the value chain. The more modular a value chain, the more you can divide it up into independent components, the easier it is to slice up. If increased functionality means that the value chain becomes less modular, then maybe that also leads to more vertical integration or more complex relationships along the chain to manage the increasing degree of coordination that's required to produce products that have simultaneous inputs in design and production from different companies. Also, if you're branding the product and you're looking to have a product which is, that you have a plan for product differentiation and increased functionality to attract more consumers over time, then you need to work with the technology supplier to know what the plan is, what the roadmap of future changes are, so that you know what the core technology is going to be able to do, and then you can plan your development of your product around that future core technology. You don't want to know that the technology is changing tomorrow and then it takes you a year to be able to take advantage of that new technology. You want to know a year in advance the technology is likely to be going in this direction. We have a year then to say, how are we going to use that new capability? How are we going to use the new possibilities that the technology opens up? And so you need to, again, it's about collaboration along the chain between the core technology supplier and the handset manufacturer. And also, of course, if you're investing both in brands and technological capabilities, this tends to mean that larger firms are going to be more effective. You can't be a small firm in this sector any longer. And therefore, at the same time, these market changes also mean that more demanding consumers, you want more quality, and therefore you're going to have an increasing emphasis on quality and a need to resolve problems quickly, and that tightens up the relationships between suppliers and buyers, because you need to have greater confidence in your supplier. and as I've already said, those tightening relationships between firms along the chain arise because of innovation, and product differentiation requires greater chain collaboration. And finally, we have the branding issue, that branding matters, and of course branding has economies of scale. We find that we see that these companies develop their own distribution networks. We also see that the companies, instead of relying on markets and to sell their products and distributors, they're increasingly using their own outlets. It's said that WeWo, for example, has 250,000 outlets across China. Now, some of those it owns, many of them are franchised, but they are dedicated to selling the product of that particular company. So that's the market explanation for the way that the industry is changing. But we also have technological change. The thing about mobile phones is that there's been a massive a massive change in technology globally since 2010. We've had the replacement of what are called feature phones by the smartphone, and this has completely transformed the global market as well as the Chinese market. Does anybody here have a phone which isn't a smartphone? For those of you online, there aren't many people here, but the percentage not having a feature phone is roughly 0. So smartphones are what people have these days. And there's also a shift, obviously, to 3G and 4G mobile technologies. And that's the big shift. And of course, that is a shift which has transformed the global industry. Global leader Nokia has basically disappeared. Global leader, the American company, Canadian company, what's it called? BlackBerry has basically disappeared because they just weren't able to make the transition. Apple has surged into the market in a way that it wasn't there before. And so even at the global level, there have been substantial changes that have nothing to do with China. I mean, nothing to do with the market in China. These are global changes that have affected the whole industry. We also think that when we see these new technologies, that maybe this is, part of the reason why modularity has broken down along the chain. That 3G and 4G technologies may be more complicated. That it may be more difficult to handle the interdependencies and interactions that happen between different parts of a mobile phone once you have these advanced technologies. I'm no expert on mobile phone technologies, but I think that managing radio frequencies, managing power to different parts of the phone, preventing interactions between parts that you don't want to interact may become more complicated. We also have a quantum leap in the role of software in smartphones. And this, again, means much more complex interactions between hardware and software. And we see that multimedia has become more important, although it did exist before smartphones. And the multimedia applications tend to create interdependencies and conflicts that have to be addressed across firm boundaries. And the result of that is that when you have a new platform or a next iteration of a platform like a Qualcomm or MTK chipset, then turning that platform into a viable new product that works increasingly involves a greater degree of inter-firm exchange of knowledge and collaboration. And of course, those factors then, the more complex technology and the more the greater degree of interactions on the chain will again favour increasing firm-level concentration. So we might have an argument that says this is not actually about the market alone, although the market has changed, but these things would have happened even without the market changing because of the nature of the technology in mobile phones specifically. So one thing that we need to do in our research is look at what happens in sectors where we don't have this technological divide. And we've done that in the case of electric two-wheelers, that's to say electric-assisted bicycles and electric motorbikes. And there we have found that there's been a greater, there's been a concentration in the industry, there's been greater cooperation between suppliers and buyers, a greater emphasis on quality, also a move out of ecologically damaging lead-acid batteries to lithium-ion batteries, which is different technology. But the change has been much slower than we see in mobile phones. So we think there's that's why we think there's a combination of both technological explanations and market explanations. So, just to summarize then, I'd say that we've seen a big shift in the Chinese market away from cheap and cheerful towards differentiated branded products. That changes in consumer demand may be driving structural changes in industry. But the case of mobile phones may be exceptional because this technological transformation is occurring at the same time and seems to have very drastic effects, and that we need to think through more the interaction between the characteristics of the market and the technology. And that's as far as I get with my presentation today. So I'm going to stop there, Mario. Thank you.
Thank you, John. If you don't mind, I'll speak in Portuguese, okay? Yeah. Bom, obrigado, John. Os internautas, já começou a chegar perguntas aqui. Internautas, perguntas, comentários, ia responde@usp.br. Pessoal aqui ao vivo, tá? Levanta o braço. A única restrição que a gente tem é que precisa falar no microfone, senão quem está na internet não ouve, tá? E se identifica, nome, entidade, etc. Enquanto chega o microfone aqui na plateia, tem uma pergunta aqui que veio pela internet, de uma pessoa cujo nome é Afonso Fleury. Tá? Afonso Fleury é um professor lá da Poli. Tá? Depois eu te apresento, John.
Are you sure it's him? Might be another Afonso Fleury.
Ele pergunta o seguinte: qual é o papel do governo e das políticas industriais no quadro descrito para a indústria chinesa? O que você prefere? Pergunta a pergunta ou a gente pega um bloco de duas, três?
Two or three.
Duas, três. Ok. Então temos lá o Leonardo, depois Mauro.
Leonardo, congratulations for your presentation, your outstanding presentation. If you mind, I will ask in português. Durante sua apresentação, comparando esses dois momentos, antes de 2010 com os celulares mais básicos e depois de 2010 com os smartphones. E uma coisa que eu fiquei pensando era, em 2010 a indústria de celulares mais básicos estava numa fase de declínio com as tecnologias altamente standardized. E o que acontece hoje com os smartphones, o mercado está mais maduro, mas as tecnologias ainda não estão totalmente consolidadas, comparadas com, por exemplo, os celulares básicos em 2010. Isso não tem efeito nesse grau de concentração das empresas? Essa é a primeira pergunta. Isso talvez não é um fator que explica porque, neste momento, as relações entre firmas, em termos de tecnologia, evoluíram e intensificaram. Eu estava pensando que em 2010, como as tecnologias estão extremamente padronizadas, era quase que eu não preciso de uma relação entre fornecedor e comprador, já que eu posso comprar essas tecnologias como se eu estivesse indo ao mercado, na Goods Oriented to Market. Esse é o meu comentário.
Leonardo Gomes da FEA.
Oi, Mauro Zibovicius, da Escola Politécnica da USP, Engenharia de Produção. Eu tenho uma pergunta que acho que é um pouco, talvez, complementar em relação ao do Afonso Fleury. Além da pergunta sobre a política industrial e o papel do governo em geral, eu queria saber um pouco sobre a governança das empresas, ou pelo menos das empresas desse setor, em relação ao governo. Quer dizer, qual é a relação entre o governo e a formulação de políticas das próprias empresas. A gente, pelo menos eu não conheço, mas às vezes se fala da China como se fosse um país com uma governança, vamos dizer, comum em relação ao Brasil. Quer dizer, o governo tem política industrial, ou pode ter, pode não, mas a ditadura é uma característica da China. Quer dizer, como isso se reflete nas decisões? Por exemplo, quando você disse na indústria automobilística, que você falou um pouco no começo, que as coisas estavam acontecendo não por causa do governo, mas sim apesar do governo. Isso me chamou a atenção. Então, não sei se ficou claro, mas é isso. Obrigado.
Yeah, yes. Okay. Well, let me start with the second question, which I think is a very good one. So the second question was saying that the shift before 2010, after 2010, from feature phone to smartphone, is also a shift from a consolidated technology to a new technology that inevitably is more, creates new problems along the chain. And I have some sympathy with that argument. I think it's a good point to make, and I shall remember it when we start rewriting some of the papers that we've been writing. I won't necessarily give you credit, but I will certainly use it. But I would say this. I think the thing about mobile phones is that the technology is changing all the time. There were significant changes even in the smartphone era, so the pre-smartphone era, with the introduction of different functionalities, already the introduction of 3G, the increasing use of music and those types of things, so that even in that period you get a constant evolution of the product, and the leading chipset manufacturers were probably providing new chipsets every 9 months, and those chipsets would typically have thousands of bugs. So you'd be finding that the product would, that even in that period, the chipset manufacturers would work with a small number of leading companies to try and iron out those problems before the product was fully put onto the market. So I think there may be a change. So first of all, I don't think we should overestimate the standardization pre-2010, because I think there are a number of things that were changing. Remember that the RF, and in each stage of 1G, to the extent it existed, 2G, 3G, 4G, we're using different technologies with different requirements for the phone. At the same time, I think that I agree with you. I think that within any value chain, there is always a tension between standardization and innovation. The more you standardize, the easier it is to do things. But you're always tempted to innovate, because then that's where you get product differentiation, functionality, and gains in the market. So businesses are constantly having to manage that relationship. And we see this fundamental change, that people are managing the relationship. There is a leap in technology that then undermines. Now, then I think the question that I would have suggested you think about is, if it's the case that we never got complete standardization pre-2010, do we get standardization in mobile? Do we get standardization in smartphones, or do we find the fact that smartphones keep evolving, that you're always going to have new problems? So the issue is the extent to which that the incremental innovations, rather than these technological leaps, also continue undermining the extent to which the product is predictable, usable arm's length, and the rest. And just one final point on that. I think one element of simplifying value chain linkages is the extent to which you can standardize across businesses and have, this is a classic thing in the electronics industry, the issue of product standards as a way of simplifying interfaces and guaranteeing interchangeability and predictability in products. And that's why there's considerable importance in the IEC standards as a way of making the industry much more predictable. So allowing disintegration while at the same time not leading to problems of manageability. Excuse me. Then there were two questions relating to government policy. So I think the first point is that government policy in China, yes, the government does intervene, but it's not all powerful. I once remember talking to somebody in a senior position in China about Chinese government policy, and he just said to me, look, 90% of the concerns of the Chinese government revolve around two things. Territorial integrity, basically Tibet and Taiwan, and keeping things under control. Because it's a big, complicated country with massive changes going on all the time. So, I don't think, I'm not sure just how much the government is able to exercise control. And there are too many things going on in the economy for the government to effectively gain control. But I think that in terms of government policy in China towards industry, it has promoted concentration, but as I say, up to 2010, it wasn't very successful in that policy. I do think, however, that other aspects of government policy have a big impact on the way these sectors develop. I think in the case of the electronics industry, including mobile phones, then obviously the promotion of industry in Shenzhen and the development of special economic zones in the south of China meant that all of these mobile phone companies had an enormous array of companies that could provide components, you could provide specialist services, assembly, design, and that, that's part of the promotion of the regional development of the area. If you go into in Shenzhen, there's a market called Hangqiaobei. I don't think I pronounced it correctly, but North Hangqiao Market in English, where you can buy anything. You can buy any part that you need for most electronics products and most mobile phones. There are thousands of stalls that sell individual items. You also, if you go to, if you're in Shenzhen, then there are thousands of companies that will, well, not thousands, there are lots of, I don't know how many, lots of companies that will provide specialist services. So you have a support infrastructure that made it very easy for small firms to operate there. And, they are actually technologically very advanced. Just in a few days in Shenzhen, I think I saw more 3D printers than I've seen in the rest of my life. Everywhere you go, there are 3D printers. There's a fantastic investment in, and people, doing a lot of open source design using, these types of products to create new things. So, but just moving further in terms of government policy and turning to the third question, Glauco's question, then I think obviously the government sector is important in China, both state-owned enterprises and formerly state-owned enterprises. And I think we see that in the mobile phone sector, from the 1990s onwards, there were certain companies that were either formerly state-owned or which grew up through very active government support for the development of technological capabilities. I'm thinking, for example, off the top of my head, and I would have to go back to make sure I got this right, but just from recent reading, the importance of Huawei, for example, that was involved in telecom switching equipment. and received a lot of support from the state. And this was a priority sector, and then it moved into mobile phones because it's built up a lot of technological capabilities in an area when it received a lot of state support. I think similarly, the company ZTE, which I think is a state-owned company, I may be wrong, has also benefit from that investment by the Chinese in core technologies in telephone switching as part of the development of their national telecom system. So I think that those firms, there is an important role of government in the development of those firms, and then they're using their capabilities in other sectors. But I think when we look at companies like Weibo and Oppo and Xiaomi, I think the relationship with the government certainly isn't as clear as far as I'm concerned, and maybe they've emerged out. Some firms like Xiaomi, as far as I know, emerged out of the small phone sector. Oppo and Weibo, I know that there's a big company behind them, but I don't know anything about it. So I don't know, precisely how they've emerged. But I think that they might be slightly less dependent on government policy, and that we're getting a new generation of firms that, that are, much more characteristically private sector than firms we've seen in China in the past.
Temos mais aqui uma rodada e tem mais perguntas na internet, mas vamos começar ao vivo. Tá? Então, você, depois o Guilherme.
Bom dia, meu nome é Luciana, eu falo lá no IEE. E eu queria fazer uma pergunta ligeiramente diferente. A gente vê em pesquisas hoje em dia muitas referências à economia circular, a maiores preocupações com o meio ambiente, com as emissões. Eu queria saber se na sua pesquisa lá você sente isso também, ou a gente simplesmente recebe a pesquisa acadêmica que isso não é realidade nas indústrias que você tem estudado.
Bom dia. Meu nome é Guilherme, sou pesquisador aqui do Observatório de Inovação e Competitividade. A minha pergunta, na realidade, se refere um pouco a mudanças nas cadeias globais de valor, mesmo você dizendo que a pesquisa foi focada nas cadeias de valor local, mas como que se houve mudanças no market share das empresas chinesas, no mercado doméstico chinês, dessa mudança tecnológica, ou seja, se o surgimento dos smartphones e o aumento da competitividade da Samsung, Apple, isso afetou de alguma forma as cadeias chinesas no mercado doméstico chinês. Aqui no Brasil nós tínhamos também algumas empresas que produziam celulares das gerações mais antigas, que acho que hoje nenhuma mais consegue, pelo menos eu não conheço nenhum smartphone produzido pela Gradiente, Positivo, CCE. Então, essa é uma pergunta. Uma outra pergunta e como que a participação das empresas chinesas nas cadeias globais de valor afetaram esse processo também interno. A China é famosa por por participar ativamente em diversas etapas nas cadeias globais de valor, inclusive de smartphones. Acho que parte dos produtos da Apple e da Samsung são produzidos na própria China. E como esse processo impacta também essas empresas que hoje dominam o mercado chinês, o mercado doméstico chinês, participam nas cadeias globais de valor, produzindo celular para outras marcas, e isso afetou as technological capabilities dessas empresas. E, por fim, também, como que as estratégias de internacionalização das empresas chinesas também podem ter afetado esse processo de concentração das cadeias globais. Eu uso um celular que é Motorola, e a marca é uma marca sueca, mas a divisão de celulares, smartphones dessa marca é da Lenovo. Então, quando eu ligo o meu celular, aparece Lenovo, não aparece Motorola, apesar de aqui atrás estar Motorola. Então, provavelmente, a Lenovo deve ter uma estratégia de internacionalização que adquiriu tecnologias que também possibilitou esse processo de integração das cadeias domésticas na própria China.
Você viu que ele deu um golpe, ele fez 3 perguntas numa só, né? Tem algumas perguntas aqui, mas acho que como elas mudam de assunto, eu vou deixar para o próximo bloco, tá? Volto. Mas eu queria ter uma pergunta aqui de um rapaz chamado Mário Sérgio Salerno, que que tem... eu não sei exatamente muito a dimensão desse fenômeno e a extensão dele, mas dá para perceber que um conjunto de grandes empresas chinesas está comprando ativos no exterior, certo? Nos Estados Unidos, alguns aqui no Brasil também, mas e na Europa, tá? Não sei se no Japão. Tá? Então, o caso da Lenovo é um caso, mas tem vários outros, tá? Isso poderia ter relação também com a tentativa de ter mais domínio de determinadas tecnologias que seriam jogadas por essas empresas importantes para o futuro de seus negócios? Ou você acha que é apenas uma questão de mercado? Eu sei que sua pesquisa não é bem sobre isso, mas queria ouvir a sua sensibilidade a respeito.
Okay, thank you, Mario. Let me deal with the Luciana's question first. We weren't looking at the circular economy or the environment in terms of mobile phones. We certainly saw it when we were looking at electric two-wheelers, because one of the big issues is lead acid batteries and their impact on the environment. And there is certainly a shift towards lithium-ion batteries. And I think that, but I can't go in any more detail about that, but I think that there are environmental constraints on Chinese businesses which are becoming more and more important. And I think obviously, we see that much more generally in terms of smog, atmosphere, water pollution, and so I think Chinese firms are under a lot of pressure. Whether they're actually going in for the full circular economy, I have no idea what the Chinese policies are on recycling, for example, and what obligations are placed on Chinese companies operating in the domestic market. So I can't say. With relationship to the questions posed by Guilherme, yes, Apple, and first of all, I think, again, it's not something I've studied, but my impression is that there were restrictions on foreign companies operating in the Chinese market at the end of the 1990s, which led to a greater degree of nationalization of product. So there was a policy move to protect or expand national producers. We also see, though, that the current national companies, or Chinese-owned companies that are the big players in the domestic market, such as Huawei, ZTE, Oppo, but they're increasingly engaging in the international market. I was in Madeira a few months ago on holiday, and I just went into a mobile phone store and certainly saw products from Huawei and ZTE, for example. I think I've seen similar products on the Avenida Paulista here. That mobile phone shops are selling Chinese-branded products, as well as the hidden ones with inside a Motorola product. We're also seeing you can buy a Chinese branded product on the market in China. So we're getting that internationalization, and people are seeing those products as acceptable alternatives to a slightly lower price, but not really cheap. I mean, not right at the low end of the market. And so I think that these Chinese brands are sort of succeeding in the international market. Now, the second part of the question was, to what extent does a company like, I think the implication of the second part of the question was, to what extent does a company like Lenovo gain experience for producing for Motorola and then leverages that experience into being able to produce high-quality products badged under its own name? And again, I have to say, I don't know. It's possible, but I don't know whether it might happen for Lenovo, who are one of the leading companies selling, as far as I know, selling mobile phones in the Chinese domestic market. I don't know whether the leading firms in the domestic market, and particularly these new arrivals who are taking a big share now, like Oppo and Vivo and Xiaomi, I don't know whether they ever acted as contract manufacturers for international brands. I just don't know. With regard to internationalization, as I say, there is some increasing export by these companies that are powerful or important in the domestic market. We are still seeing very, very substantial shipments of smartphones to low-end markets in Africa and the Middle East and South Asia, Southeast Asia. So the company that I mentioned that's selling 1.5 million phones a month, sells them to telecom companies in India. A lot of mobile phones from this sector used to go anyway, to traders in Dubai, who would then sell them across Africa. They also sell directly, they also sell to another range of traders who then sell them on to, say, telecom companies in maybe South Africa, maybe Nigeria, Kenya, and the rest. So there is still a non-smartphone market, export market for really cheap phones in low-income countries. And we're also seeing increasingly a market for Chinese smartphones in a range of countries, including Brazil, and a number of companies in Europe. And so I think that's all I can say about that case. Mario, your point about acquiring technological capability through purchases, yes, we see that. We see that across a number of sectors. We've seen it in the wind sector, for example. We've seen it in computers, with Lenovo and IBM. But for me, the really interesting feature of that from a value chain point of view is the fragmentation of innovation itself. That in the past, if you wanted innovative capability, you might have had to purchase a manufacturing company because innovation capability would be internalized. We see increasingly today that innovation capability itself is being sliced up. And so if you want to know something about car design, then if you're a Chinese company, and this is an actual case, you buy a specialized design company based in Worthing, just near where I live in Brighton, which employs hundreds of engineers, and you just buy the engineering company, you don't buy the manufacturing company. And I can't remember the name of the engineering company, but it provides design services. And I think that this idea, the whole growth globally of knowledge-intensive business services and the growth of specialist technology suppliers means that, as well as, I think, the increasing technological capability of suppliers themselves, means that the options for acquiring technological capability through purchasing has increased enormously. So if you take the case of Tata, for example, in India, when they wanted to produce their own car, the small car, and before that they were basically a truck company, then Tata basically invited a lot of international automotive manufacturing companies, component companies, to come to India and supply their factory in Pune. And so and since those automotive companies were no longer drawing supply companies that work with the technology of the assemblers, but in fact provided the assemblers with corners and platforms and all of those concepts we have about the way cars are now divided up, then they were able to reduce the costs of entry into the automotive, in passenger car industry, by relying on assemblers increasingly. So I think that the way in which, where innovation takes place and the way it's sliced up means that the options for acquiring technological capability have really been transformed. And we see this, for example, also in the pharmaceutical industry. There are companies that just do clinical tests for pharmaceutical companies. So if you want to build a pharmaceutical company and develop new products, then testing is something that is no longer a capability you need. Because there are lots of companies in South Africa that will do tests. And there are other parts of that slicing up of the innovation chain, if you want, which I think, that there's a structural shift in the way in which it's now possible to acquire technological capabilities. And I think that's the underlying issue that question raises.
Tem Tem uma pergunta aqui que volta para as questões de política industrial e, digamos assim, desenvolvimento econômico de uma forma mais ampla. A pergunta do Afonso Fleury é uma outra. Tá? Ele diz o seguinte: há 30 anos atrás, quando o Japão emergiu como potência industrial, Fumio Kodama definiu Technological Fusion como o típico modelo de inovação industrial. A inovação dependeria mais do trabalho coletivo de diferentes tipos de empresa, por exemplo, em robótica, do que de uma ruptura tecnológica de uma empresa solitária. Aí vem a pergunta: o modelo de inovação descrito para o caso dos celulares da China pode ter uma gênese similar? Pode ser uma manifestação dos traços culturais e econômicos do país? Tem uma outra aqui que é parecida. Se a indústria chinesa ela estaria... como você compararia, deixa eu reformular aqui o que foi escrito, como você compararia a trajetória típica, que é, digamos, um estereótipo, a trajetória típica da indústria japonesa e da indústria coreana versus a trajetória da indústria chinesa? Ou seja, no desenvolvimento da indústria no Japão, no desenvolvimento da indústria na Coreia, que eles imitavam, depois eles foram desenvolvendo produtos de entrada nos mercados, e aí eles foram desenvolvendo tecnologia, marcas, etc, etc. A China tenderia a seguir, assim, genericamente falando, o mesmo caminho? Só uma coisa, internautas, aproveitem, daqui a pouco a gente encerra, e responde@usp.br para as perguntas chegarem aqui. responde@usp.br.
Well, perhaps I should start with a health warning, like they print on your tobacco labels, tobacco packets. I'm not an expert on innovation. I work on value chains. I think that the value chain approach is relatively weak on innovation, and that when one looks at value chains and thinks about upgrading, that's not the same as innovation. We need to bring innovation systems work and value chain work more closely together, and there are some attempts to do that. So, I'm not very well qualified to answer the questions that have just been posed. In terms of the mobile phone sector, I think that, the technological rupture, whether it's a rupture or it's a fusion, is really from outside of China. And so, China is a sort of, in terms of basic mobile phone technology, is clearly a technology taker rather than a technology maker or transformer. And so, I think that, I think we just have to remember that China is still at a relatively early stage in terms of transforming technologies. And in that case, I think when I'm thinking about the comparison between China and Japan and Korea, my first question would be, when? Are we talking about Korea when it was assembling products, assembling products for Japanese firms? And are we talking about Korea when Korea was developing its OEM manufacturer or developing designs and then developing brands? Because I think that there's been a change over a period of time in the acquisition of technology and technological capabilities in Korea, but I think we also see it over the longer term in China. And I guess that for me the question would be, and I don't have an answer, but I think the answer to the question really lies in whether you think that Japan started as a closed economy, developed its capabilities, and then went open, whereas China, in a sense, has started as an open economy and is now trying to internalize much more. Or whether, and in the case of Korea, I think that it probably a little bit more like what I've just said about China in that case, that it started relying on external technologies and supplying simple products to external markets and then internalize the capabilities. So I think that, I don't have a clear answer to those questions, but I think that I'm not sure there is a typical trajectory. And one of the reasons for that is that the external environment changes so much over a period of time. So a typical trajectory for Japan in the 1930s or 1950s would be very different from a typical trajectory in the 1990s or in the 2010s. So that's not really an answer. I'm explaining why I can't answer the question.
Ok. Bom, eu tenho aqui uma série de especulações, né? Eu fui para a China em 2005, acho. 2005. Fevereiro de 2005.
So is this your question?
Eu estava no IPEA, eu fui com o Glauco era presidente do IPEA, eu era diretor. Nós fomos na China numa missão diplomática para assinar uma diplomática festiva, certo? Para assinar um acordo de cooperação com um órgão similar, que não era exatamente similar, mas parecido com o IPEA na China. Okay? E aí, uma das coisas que a gente fez foi uma reunião com empresas brasileiras na China, que foi feita na embaixada em Pequim. Né? Então, o embaixador ele chamou um conjunto digamos, dos representantes executivos de empresas brasileiras na China. E eu fiz uma pergunta para não vou falar o nome da empresa, mas para uma pessoa que estava lá, que era o seguinte: bom, vocês têm um sócio chinês, sim. E quando tem um conflito, por exemplo, trabalhista, como isso é resolvido? Então, tem um conflito com os seus funcionários. Né? Ele fala, bom, a gente conversa com o sócio chinês que resolve. Depois, 2. Perguntei, quando você tem um problema de fornecimento, vem um lote que está fora de especificação, você precisa devolver ou resolver problemas de disputas contratuais, ele me falou o seguinte, a gente conversa com o sócio chinês que resolve. Aí eu fui explorando, o sócio chinês, basicamente, era uma pessoa indicada pelo partido, né? Porque os associados deles, tá certo? A firma chinesa, rigorosamente, era uma firma estatal. Né? Era aquela, digamos, talvez fosse o período pré-2010, etc. Tá? Talvez isso não seja muito comum na área de smartphones, mas para mim aquilo ficou muito forte. Então tem uma certa operação, tem a ver com a questão do Mauro lá atrás. Tem uma parte, ou tinha uma parte da operação do Estado que se dá fora do Estado, no modelo de Estado que a gente tem, assim, entre aspas, separação de poderes, etc. Mas isso dá uma certa dinâmica, pelo menos em algumas empresas. Você tem alguma experiência dessa? Você acha que isso ainda interfere nos mercados e no desenvolvimento chinês? Uma segunda e última, é bem diferente. A gente costuma estereotipar a China como produção em volume muito alto, um país muito grande, com um custo de produção baixo, seja porque antigamente eles tinham salários baixos, mas seja porque eles têm produtividade alta, facilidade de insumos, ou sei lá o quê. Tá? Mas a gente fala muito pouca coisa, ou pelo menos se ouve muito pouca coisa sobre, por exemplo, produção de bens não padronizados, bens de capital por encomenda, ou serviços de engenharia menos padronizados, mais caso a caso. Na pesquisa que vocês estão fazendo lá, esse setor acaba entrando? Você tem alguma menção de como a China está andando nesses setores?
Okay. Well, let me answer the second question first. No. I should say that I'm not responsible for for really the field work in this. I've made a visit with my colleagues from Japan, Chinese and Japanese colleagues, and we visited some companies. But there are people that I'm working with have been working on China and have good links and have been working on China for a number of years now, maybe 10 years, and so they have an understanding of this that is way beyond mine, and they might be able to answer that question. I think there is an increasing literature though on technological change in China. This idea of frugal innovation, for example, that it's not that the Chinese don't know how to innovate, but the extent of looking at non-standardized sectors or one-off products, I really don't know. But obviously Chinese construction firms are big globally and very competitive, even when you say, well, it's all about, or you might say, this is all about subsidies and, that does exist. But when you look at World Bank contracts that shouldn't be subject to those types of influences, then, the Chinese firms are very competitive. So, I think there's something to be looked at there. In terms of your first question, it's really about the party state, isn't it? And there's a sense in China in which you have two parallel sources of authority. One is the state, and one is the party. And those two kind of exist side by side. They have their own institutional forms. You find that certain, for example, institutes in Beijing one might be considered attached to the party, and another is attached to the state. You find that people will say, that there is this organization, this institutional, this committee, which is a state committee, but there's also a party committee. And then, as you were talking about in relation to state-owned enterprises, very often there will be party people put in key positions. I remember once meeting somebody, a friend of a friend, who was actually the sort of party person who sat beside the managing director or the top functionary in one of the largest state-owned banks in China. And she was there as a representative of the party, as a sort of parallel person, so since you've got parallel structures. And that gets very complicated. It gets even more complicated if you remember that the state is not just a federal state. You also have provinces that have a lot of power. And I had a colleague, for example, I had a student who did a thesis on the melamine scandal in milk in China. And she was looking at the interactions between party and state in Inner Mongolia, which is one of the areas that produces a lot of milk and where at least one of the big milk producing companies went bust in the end or was taken over by a state company after the crisis. And so you have firm, you have party at local level and national level, and you have government administration at not local, but provincial level and national level. So you get very, very complicated interactions. And I think that certainly in the state-owned sector, the party permeates pretty much all the way through. I really don't know whether the kind of firms that we were looking at in the mobile phone sector, particularly the ones that aren't obviously state-owned, how the party operates in those firms and what role they have. That, in a sense, would be a very interesting piece of research, but not research that we're planning to carry out. But certainly, yeah, the party still permeates, and that's a really, really interesting question.
Ok, gente. Mais uma última pergunta. Podemos encerrar? Então, antes de agradecer o John, eu queria comunicar que amanhã, às 10 da manhã, eu não vou estar aqui, eu estou dando aula, mas o Glauco vai conduzir. Nós vamos ter um seminário com o Jorge Guimarães, que é o presidente da Embrap. Embrap é a Empresa Brasileira de Pesquisa e Inovação Industrial, acho que essa é a sigla. É uma tentativa, digamos assim, vou falar de maneira livre, de emular o sistema Fraunhofer alemão, né, mais ou menos, mas é uma empresa, digamos assim, mantida pelo Estado, que apoia a inovação nas indústrias, basicamente, né, e opera de uma forma parecida com Fraunhofer. Ela credencia alguns institutos, né, e aí aloca algum recurso nesses institutos, empresas fazem contratos com esses institutos e tem algum tipo de subsídio. Então, amanhã, às 10 horas da manhã, o Jorge Guimarães, que é o presidente da Embrap, vai estar aqui discutindo o papel da Embrap no fomento à inovação no Brasil. Okay? Então, todos convidados a participarem dessa discussão. Na página da internet do Observatório, cuja entrada é oic.nap.usp.br, tem uma videoteca, né, onde os seminários passados, e daqui a um tempo esse seminário de hoje, eles estão lá, os vídeos estão lá, né, e vocês podem acessar gratuitamente, assistindo seminários passados com a apresentação fica no vídeo também. No vídeo, desculpa. Mas, em cada seminário tem o vídeo, tá? E tem os materiais associados. Né? Tem aproximadamente uns 100 vídeos, né, de seminários passados sobre os temas mais diversos relativos a, digamos assim, grosso modo, inovação e desenvolvimento. Tá? Eu queria agradecer aqui o pessoal que trabalhou para que esse seminário acontecesse, tá? A Sandra Cedini e a Fernanda da comunicação, a Raimunda dos Santos da Copa, a Maria Calazans, nossa fotógrafa, o Mauro, jornalista, e os nossos dois operadores, diretores de imagem, o Fellini e o Antonioni, né, que são o Jorge Paulo Soares, que é aquele, para quem está aqui, aquele que está voltado para a janela, tá? E o Sérgio Bernardo, que a gente não está vendo, bom, quem está em casa não está vendo mesmo, mas ele está atrás do micro, a gente só vê o topo da cabeça dele, tá certo? Que eles são os responsáveis diretos para que as imagens sejam captadas, eles editam as imagens que vão para o ar, né, e depois eles fazem uma edição para que o vídeo possa subir na internet de uma forma, digamos, melhor, tá? Mais fácil de assistir. Então, sem eles, isso aqui não seria possível. Obrigado, John, muito obrigado. Eu sei que esse negócio bilíngue, assim, exige um consumo de energia maior do que o usual. Obrigado pela disposição, foi uma oportunidade, nós conseguimos achar um buraco na agenda do John e entulhá-lo mais de coisas para fazer esse seminário. Né? É isso, gente. Então, o convite para amanhã está lançado, ok? Obrigado.